Most people spend their entire lives feeling like they landed on the wrong planet, like everyone else got a manual they never received. If that's you, stay with me, because what they told you was your weakness. It's actually the rarest form of psychological wiring on Earth, and by the time I'm done, you're going to stop apologizing for it. There is a particular kind of loneliness that only a Heyoka empath understands. It is not the loneliness of being alone in a room. It is the loneliness of being in a crowd of people who are all smiling at you and knowing with absolute certainty that the smile disappeared the moment you walked in. You didn't do anything wrong. You didn't say anything offensive. You simply showed up. And somehow, that was enough to make the temperature in the room drop 10 degrees. This is not your imagination. This is not paranoia. This is the mirror effect, and it is the most misunderstood and most punished gift a human being can carry. Here is what is actually happening. Every single person walking this earth is carrying something they have not dealt with. Rage they buried under politeness. Shame they painted over with confidence. Fear they converted into aggression. Grief they renamed as ambition. Most people spend their entire lives in rooms full of other unhealed people, and because everyone is performing the same denial, nobody has to face anything real. It is a collective agreement, an unspoken social contract that says we will not go there. We will keep it surface. We will keep it comfortable. And then you walk in. You are not trying to expose anyone. You are not carrying a weapon. You are simply being what you are, a being whose nervous system is wired so differently, so deeply, that your mere presence acts like a frequency. And that frequency does not allow pretense to survive near it. The mask that somebody has been wearing for 15 years starts to feel uncomfortable the moment you sit next to them. The story they have been telling themselves, the one that keeps them from looking at what they actually did, who they actually are, what they actually feel, that story starts to crack. Not because you said a word, because you exist. And people do not thank you for that. They cannot. Because the moment they would have to thank you, they would also have to admit that something in them needed to be seen. And that admission alone would unravel everything they have constructed. So instead, they call you intense. They call you exhausting. They say there is something off about you, something they cannot quite put their finger on. They pull away without explanation. They exclude you from things and convince themselves it is not personal. They gaslight you into believing that the discomfort in the room is something you created, something you caused, something you should fix by becoming smaller, quieter, less. And here is where the damage happens. Because you are an empath, which means you feel their discomfort as if it were your own. You absorb their unease, and you begin to perform a kind of psychological surgery on yourself, cutting away the parts of you that seem to trigger them, sanding down the edges of your presence, dimming your own frequency so that the people around you do not have to feel what they are not ready to feel. You do this quietly. You do this without anyone asking you to. You do this because somewhere inside you, you made a decision that their comfort was worth more than your truth. That decision is the most expensive one you will ever make, because the mirror cannot stop being a mirror. You can cover it. You can turn it to the wall. You can drape cloth over it and pretend it is furniture. But the moment that cloth slips, and it always slips, the reflection comes back, clear, uncompromising, exact. And the people who feared it most will blame you again. Not because you failed them, but because you reminded them of something they are not yet brave enough to face. The Heyoka in ancient Lakota tradition was not a gentle figure. The Heyoka was the sacred clown, the thunder dreamer, the one who walked backwards through the village doing everything in reverse, not to entertain, but to disturb, to disrupt, to crack open the comfortable so that something true could breathe. The Heyoka was feared and revered in the same breath because the tribe understood something that modern society has completely forgotten, that the most powerful healing does not come wrapped in warmth. Sometimes it comes wrapped in discomfort. Sometimes the most loving thing a presence can do is refuse to let you lie to yourself. You have heard it your entire life. In different voices, different tones, different rooms, but always the same message. You are too sensitive. You feel too. Go deeply. You care too much. You think too much. You give too much. You are too intense, too emotional, too present, too aware. The word too has followed you like a shadow since the moment you were old enough to understand that the way you experienced the world was not the way everyone else experienced it. And for a long time, maybe even now, you believe them. You took that word and you built a cage out of it. A cage you climbed into voluntarily because the alternative was continuing to exist in a world that kept flinching every time you showed up fully. But here is what nobody told you. The people calling you too much were not qualified to measure you. Think about what it actually means when someone tells you that you feel too deeply. It means they have decided there is a correct depth at which a human being should feel things. It means they have drawn a line, usually right at the edge of their own comfort zone, and declared everything beyond it excessive. Everything beyond it problematic. Everything beyond it yours to fix. But that line was never drawn with wisdom. It was drawn with fear. It was drawn by people who learned early that feeling things fully was dangerous, that caring without limits led to pain, that being completely present in your own emotional experience was a vulnerability they could not afford. So they capped themselves. They put a ceiling on their own depth. And then, because human beings cannot tolerate the sight of someone else living without the limitations they imposed on themselves, they tried to put that same ceiling on you. What they could not see, what they refused to see, is that somewhere in the world, there is a person sitting in complete darkness. Not metaphorical darkness. Real, suffocating, I cannot see a way forward darkness. And that person does not need someone who feels things at a socially acceptable level. That person does not need someone who cares within comfortable boundaries. That person needs exactly you. They need the version of you that feels so deeply it frightens people. They need the version of you that stays present in someone else's pain long after everyone else has found an excuse to leave the room. They need the version of you that does not look away, does not minimize, does not rush toward a silver lining just to make itself more comfortable. They need your too much because you're too much. Quote is the only thing that actually reaches them. There is a particular kind of human moment that most people are completely unequipped to handle. It is the moment when someone stops performing okayness and lets you see the actual wreckage underneath. Most people, when they encounter that moment, do one of two things. They panic and try to fix it, throwing solutions at pain like solutions are the same thing as presence. Or they retreat physically, emotionally, energetically, because what they are seeing is activating something unresolved in themselves, and staying feels like too high a cost. Either response leaves the person in darkness alone. Either response communicates, without words, that their pain is too much for the room. You do not do that. You cannot do that. It is not in your wiring. When someone breaks open in front of you, something in you moves toward it rather than away from it. Not to fix, not to perform compassion. But because your nervous system is built to hold what other nervous systems drop. Your capacity to sit inside someone else's pain without needing it to resolve, without needing it to make sense, without needing it to end so that you can feel comfort. Able again that capacity is not weakness. It is a form of psychological strength so rare that most people will go their entire lives without ever encountering it in another human being. The Heyoka empath does not just feel emotions passing through a room. The Heyoka absorbs the emotional weather of an entire environment and processes it in ways that other people's systems are simply not designed to handle. This is why you are exhausted in ways that sleep does not fix. This is why you can walk into a gathering where everyone is smiling and immediately feel the grief underneath the smiling. This is why you know things about people that they have not told you because they did not need to tell you. Their energy already did, and the world will keep calling that too much because the world has not yet developed the language to call it what it actually is. People who have never lived inside a storm cannot understand why someone would choose to stay there. And from the outside, that is exactly what it looks like when you observe the life of a Heyoka empath. It looks like a choice. It looks like self-destruction dressed up as sensitivity. It looks like someone who cannot get out of their own way, who attracts drama, who lives in a constant state of emotional turbulence that a reasonable person would have figured out how to calm by now. The people watching your life from a comfortable distance have opinions about this. They offer advice in the language of stability. Just think positive, just think positive, just set boundaries, just stop feeling everything so intensely. As if the storm you are carrying is a result of poor decision-making. As if you simply forgot to choose peace. What they do not understand is that the chaos was never yours to begin with. A Heyoka empath does not generate disorder. A Heyoka empath reveals it. There is a fundamental difference between those two things, and almost no one in your life has ever been able to see it clearly. When chaos follows you into a room, it is not because you brought it in through the door. It is because the chaos was already there, sitting quietly underneath the surface of things, hiding behind routine and small talk and the performance of normalcy that most social environments depend on to function. Your presence does not create the disorder. Your presence makes it impossible for the disorder to keep hiding. And the moment it surfaces, the moment the tension that everyone was successfully ignoring suddenly becomes visible and unavoidable, the room looks at you. Because you were the variable that changed. Because you were the one who arrived and disrupted the equilibrium. And so you become, in the story they tell themselves, the cause. But a thermometer does not cause a fever. It simply makes the temperature impossible to ignore. This is what your chaos actually is. It is a diagnostic instrument. It is a sensitivity so finely tuned that it picks up signals that every other instrument in the room has been calibrated to miss. When you walk into a relationship, and within weeks everything begins to shake, the unspoken resentments, the buried incompatibilities, the agreements people made with each other out of fear rather than genuine alignment, that shaking is not your fault. That shaking was always coming. You simply accelerated the timeline. You compressed years of slow deterioration into weeks of visible truth, and people will hate you for that compression. They will blame you for the collapse of things that were already collapsing. They will point to your arrival as the moment Eve. Everything went wrong, because pointing at you is infinitely easier than admitting that everything was already wrong before you got there. What makes this particularly devastating for a Heyoka is that you feel the weight of that blame fully. You do not have the emotional insulation that would allow you to dismiss it. When someone looks at you and says you ruined something, you carry that. You turn it over in your hands in the middle of the night. You construct elaborate internal arguments for and against your own innocence. You search your behavior for the proof that they are right, because part of you has been trained since childhood to assume that when things fall apart near you, you are the reason. That training is the real damage, not the chaos itself. Because here is the truth about what you are actually carrying. Every experience of upheaval you have moved through, every relationship that detonated in your hands, every environment that could not sustain your presence, every version of stability that dissolved the moment you stopped pretending, all of it has been building something in you that most people never develop. It has been building a navigational system, a deep, embodied, wide, visceral understanding of what is real versus what is constructed, of what is alive versus what is simply being maintained out of habit or fear, of where genuine connection exists versus where connection is being performed to avoid loneliness. Most people navigate their lives using the map that their culture handed them. The map that says stability equals safety, that consistency equals health, that the absence of conflict equals happiness. You have never been able to use that map because your experience has shown you, repeatedly and without mercy, that the map is wrong, that the smoothest surfaces are often the most hollow, that the quietest relationships are sometimes the most suffocating, that the most ordered environments are frequently built on the deepest denial. Your chaos burned those false maps, every single one of them. And now you navigate by something older and more accurate than any map your culture could have given you. You navigate by direct contact with what is actually true, by the feeling in your body when something is off even when everything looks fine, by the knowledge that arrives before the evidence does, by the compass that was forged specifically in the fire of everything you were never supposed to survive. There is a difference between empathy and what you do. Most people understand empathy as the ability to recognize what someone else is feeling and respond to it with care. It is a cognitive and emotional bridge. You see someone crying, something in you registers their pain, you feel moved to comfort them. That is empathy. That is a beautiful and necessary human capacity. But what you do is not that. What you do does not begin with recognition. It does not start with observation. It starts before you have even consciously registered that another person is in pain. It starts in your body, in your nervous system, in some layer of your awareness that operates below the threshold of thought. And by the time your mind catches up, you are already inside their experience. Not beside it, inside it. This is the distinction that changes everything. Most empaths feel with people. You feel as them. You have spent years confused by this. Confused by the way you can walk into a room as one version of yourself and walk out as someone you do not recognize. Confused by how a conversation with a particular person leaves you not just emotions, ionally drained but fundamentally altered, as if something of theirs got into you and rearranged the furniture. Confused by the way you sometimes cannot locate where your feelings end and another person's feelings begin. You have probably spent a significant portion of your life believing that this confusion was a personal failing, a lack of self-definition, a psychological weakness that a more grounded, more developed version of you would have resolved by now. But it is not a weakness, it is a function. Your nervous system was built with a permeability that most human nervous systems do not have. Where other people have walls, psychological membranes that maintain a clear distinction between self and other, you have something closer to a membrane that breathes. That takes in. That processes not just the emotional content of the people around you, but the full texture of who they are, their history, their wounds, their desires, their shame, their private architecture. You do not extract this information consciously. You do not ask for it. It moves into you the way weather moves into an open space, not because anything invited it, but because there was nothing there to stop it. This is why certain people feel inexplicably drawn to you, not because you are performing warmth or executing social skills correctly, but because somewhere beneath their conscious awareness, they recognize that you are the first space they have ever entered where they do not have to translate themselves, where the version of them that exists underneath the version they show the world is not just tolerated, but actually perceived, actually met. You do not need them to explain their pain in organized language. You are already holding it before they find the words. And for people who have spent their entire lives feeling fundamentally unseen, that experience of being known without explanation is so rare and so profound that it can feel like salvation. But here is the cost that nobody talks about. When you absorb an identity, you do not just borrow it for the duration of the interaction and return it neatly when the conversation ends. It stays. It layers. Over years, over hundreds of interactions, over a lifetime of taking in what other people could not carry themselves, you accumulate a weight that has no clean name in any psychological framework most people have access to. It is north. OT depression, though it can look like depression. It is not anxiety, though it can feel like anxiety. It is the weight of carrying fragments of other people's unlived lives inside a body that was only designed to carry one. This is why solitude is not a preference for you. It is maintenance. It is the necessary process of sitting quietly inside yourself long enough to locate what is actually yours, which thoughts, which feelings, which impulses originated in you versus which ones drifted in from the last person who sat across from you and let their guard down. Most people do not need to perform this kind of internal archaeology. Most people know where they end and the world begins. For you, that boundary is not a given. It is something you have to consciously reconstruct, regularly, deliberately, as an act of psychological survival. And the people who have never had to do that work will never fully understand why you sometimes disappear. Why do you cancel plans without explanation? Why you need days of silence after a single intense conversation? Why you emerge from social situations that looked perfectly normal from the outside, looking hollowed out in ways that take longer than a night's sleep to repair. They will call it antisocial. They will call it flaky. They will call it yet another version of too much. What it actually is the inevitable cost of being a being who does not just witness human experience, but inhabits it. Who does not just stand at the edge of other people's inner worlds and peer in, but walks through the door and sits down and stays long enough to understand what it actually feels like to live there. It began before you were old enough to have a defense against it. Before you had the language to push back, before you had the self-awareness to recognize what was happening, the training started. It did not arrive as cruelty, though sometimes it wore that face. More often it arrived as concern, as correction, as the well-meaning guidance of people who loved you and were genuinely frightened by what they saw in you, not because what they saw was dangerous, but because what they saw was unfamiliar. Because your teachers did not have a framework for a child who felt the emotional undercurrent of every classroom interaction. Because your parents did not have a manual for a child who cried at things that nobody else seemed to notice, picked up on tension before the adults in the room had acknowledged it themselves, who asked questions that reached into places most grown people had agreed never to look. And so they did what people do when they encounter something they cannot categorize. They tried to normalize it. They tried to sand it down into a shape that the existing world could accommodate. Stop crying so much. You are too sensitive. You cannot take everything so personally. You need to toughen up. You cannot save everyone. You need to learn to switch off. These were not instructions handed down by villains. They were instructions handed down by survivors people who had their own depth trained out of them and who genuinely believed they were protecting you from the pain that depth had caused them. They were passing on the only wisdom they had, the wisdom of contraction, the wisdom of making yourself smaller so that the world around you would feel less overwhelming. The wisdom of building walls because walls had kept them functional, even if walls had also kept them half alive. You received that wisdom young enough that it bypassed your critical thinking entirely and went straight into your identity. Ate into the story you told yourself about who you were and what was acceptable about you and what needed to be hidden. You did not just learn to perform smallness in certain rooms. You learned to believe in it. You learned to experience your own depth as a liability, your sensitivity as a malfunction, your awareness as a burden. You internalized the correction so completely that you began to do the shrinking without anyone asking. You became your own most efficient editor, cutting the parts of yourself most likely to make other people uncomfortable before they even had the chance to ask you to. And here is where the real damage lands. Not in what the world did to you, but in what you did to yourself in response. Because while you were busy shrinking, the world was accumulating a deficit that your gift was specifically designed to address. Think about the landscape of human connection right now. Think about the epidemic of loneliness that exists inside a civilization more connected by technology than any in human history. Think about the millions of people who have never once in their lives experienced the sensation of being truly seen, not performed at, not analyzed, not engaged, but actually witnessed in the fullness of who they are. Think about the leaders making decisions from a place of complete emotional disconnection from the human consequences of those decisions. Think about the families sitting in the same rooms for decades, speaking to each other in the surface language of logistics and routine, while entire oceans of unspoken truth sit underneath every conversation they are not having. The world is not suffering from an excess of sensitivity. The world is suffering from a catastrophic shortage of it. Every system that is breaking down right now, every institution that has lost the trust of the people it was built to serve, every community that has fractured along lines of fear and misunderstanding, every relationship that has collapsed under the weight of things that were never said, all of it is downstream of a collective failure to feel. A collective failure to sit inside discomfort long enough to understand it. A collective failure to prioritize truth over comfort, depth over efficiency, genuine human contact over the performance of it. And you, the one they told, was too much, too sensitive, too feeling you are carrying the specific capacity that every single one of those failures required and could not find. The training was not random. Systems do not accidentally suppress the things that would most effectively challenge them. The pressure you felt to shrink was proportional to the threat your fullness represented. Not to the people applying the pressure. Most of them were simply passing on their own conditioning without any awareness of what they were doing, but to the structures underneath, to the agreements that entire social architectures are built on, the agreement that efficiency matters more than truth, that productivity matters more than presence, that the appearance of wellness matters more than the actual experience of it. You were trained to shrink because a world built on surface cannot survive contact with someone who refuses to stay there. Power is one of the most misunderstood words in the human vocabulary. The version of power that most people have been taught to recognize comes with visible markers: a title, a platform, a voice that commands rooms, an authority that arrives announced, that makes itself known through volume or position or the kind of confidence that fills space in ways everyone can see and measure. That is the version of power that gets written about, rewarded, modeled in every institution from the classroom to the boardroom. It is power that operates through action, through assertion, through the deliberate application of force in a chosen direction. That is not your power. And for most of your life, because your power looked nothing like that version, you assumed you did not have any. What you have is something older, something that does not need a platform to operate. Something that does not require your permission or your awareness or even your presence in the conscious sense of the word. It functions the way gravity functions, not by announcing itself, not by asking for cooperation, but simply by existing and allowing everything in its proximity to respond accordingly. You do not decide to make people uncomfortable. You do not strategize or calculate or position yourself for maximum impact. You simply arrive. And the arrival alone is enough to begin a process in the people around you that most they have spent considerable energy and years of habitual self-protection trying to prevent. The process is this: When a person who has been successfully avoiding their own truth encounters a presence that cannot coexist with avoidance, something in them is forced to move, not because you pushed it, not because you named it or confronted it or even acknowledged it, but because your frequency and their unresolved interior cannot occupy the same space without creating friction. That friction is what they experience as discomfort. That discomfort is what they misread as a problem with you. And that misreading is one of the oldest and most consistent patterns in the life of every Heyoka empath who has ever existed: the confusion of the effect for the cause, the confusion of the mirror for the thing it reflects. Think about the specific texture of the reactions you have generated in people over the course of your life. Not the ones who drifted away quietly, the ones who reacted, the ones whose response to your presence was disproportionate, too intense, too personal, too loaded with an energy that